Hey everybody, Sue's here. Today I am showing you 17, that's right, 17 keto soups, stews, and chili recipes. All of these low-carb, keto-friendly recipes are perfect for staying warm during this wintry weather we're all having, as well as for meal prepping for your week. I know this video is long, but it's meant to be a digital video keto cookbook of sorts, and all the individual recipes are linked with chapters, as well as the original recipe links in the description box of this video. So feel free to just use this as a reference guide by jumping around and just clicking to the specific recipes that you're interested in. And while you're at it, also go ahead and make sure you save this video to your favorites or your bookmarks, or even share it to a playlist or to one of your social media sites so that you do not lose track of it and you always have it handy to refer back to when you're looking for a new low-carb soup idea. All right, let's go ahead and get into this compilation video of a lot of the keto soups we have made over the last couple of years. I wanna catch the wave. First up, we made this awesome keto cabbage soup. This original recipe is from Ketogasm, which of course I'll have a link down below. I did adapt it quite a bit just to make it easier on me and more to my liking. I love this recipe because it's actually 10 servings, so it's perfect to meal prep with and have in the refrigerator to heat left over all week long. So to start with, in a large pot over medium heat, I just have 2 pounds of lean ground beef, and I'm not going to drain this after I brown it, so I did go ahead and use about, I think, 88% lean on this. And I'm just using my handy dandy meat chopper upper. I always have linked in the description box down below to break this apart while I brown it. And I've been told by a couple subscribers you can also find versions of this at Dollar Tree and Dollar General. After my meat's about halfway through browning, I am just adding a half a teaspoon sea salt to it, as well as a half a teaspoon black pepper, and then continuing to get in there and break it apart and brown it. Adding a third of a cup of diced up white onion to that and working it into our ground beef as well, before adding 1 teaspoon of minced garlic, 1 teaspoon of ground cumin, and then I'm adding a whole can of Rotel, which is just tomato and chile blend, and I did not drain this. I just added juice and all. And then one of the major changes is she uses bouillon cubes in her recipe. I'm just going to skip all of that and use 1 32-ounce box, so 4 cups of beef broth. And I think this is actually full sodium beef broth. I usually use low sodium. Stirring that all around before adding some cabbage to this. Now, you could just chop up a head of cabbage, but to make things easier for me, I'm using 2 10-ounce bags of angel hair shredded green cabbage, and that's just straight plain cabbage. You could definitely use a tricolor blend with this if you wanted to. And I'm stirring this from the bottom to just kind of tuck all of that cabbage down in there so it can get nice and tender, and bringing that up to a boil. And after I do, I'm just putting the lid on this, and I'm just going to let this simmer for about 45 minutes. This is what it looks like after it is done cooking. And of course, these flavors are going to just marinate together even more in the refrigerator all week long. And it's one of those recipes that gets better and better, I think, as the week goes. And here it is, served up. Absolutely delicious. Again, easy to cut in half if you want to make a smaller batch of this. Highly recommend giving it a try. Next up, we made I Breathe, I'm Hungry's Keto Pot Sticker Meatball Asian Soup. So to start with, in a large mixing bowl, I'm adding 1 pound of ground pork, 1 large egg, a third of a cup almond flour, a teaspoon of minced ginger, a third of a cup chopped green onions. I used the white parts, the light green, and some of the regular green. A tablespoon of soy sauce, a half a teaspoon of garlic powder, and half a teaspoon of kosher salt. And then I'm just getting in there with my hands and mixing that all together really well. Once I have it combined, I'm taking a baking sheet, lining it with some nonstick foil. You can see that I have my meat portioned kind of in half. And that was just an easier way for me to kind of keep up with my portion sizes. We're just going to make 24 of these little mini meatballs total. I just did 6 rows of 4, and then I'm going to pop those into a 375-degree oven for 15 minutes. While those are cooking, I'm getting started on my soup. So in a large saucepan, I'm adding a tablespoon of sesame oil over medium-high heat. heat. To that, I'm adding 2 tablespoons of minced ginger and a teaspoon of minced garlic, cooking that for about a minute until it all starts to sizzle and become nice and fragrant. On top of that, I'm adding 32 ounces of chicken broth. I always like to use the low sodium broth as it just gives me more control over my salt content. Along with that, I'm also adding 2 cups of water, a tablespoon of soy sauce, and I'm adding a tablespoon of fish sauce. You can see this is the fish sauce right here that I'm using. This has less than 1 gram of carbs per tablespoon. Make sure you shop around and find a good low carb fish sauce. Also adding a half a teaspoon of red pepper flakes and a half a teaspoon of kosher salt. I'm stirring this all together and bringing it to a boil. Once I have that boiling nicely, I'm going to turn it down and let it simmer for at least 10 minutes. Now I'm just sliding that pot out of the way, getting a smaller but deeper saucepan and a little wire mesh strainer in the top of it. I am going to strain all of that goodness out of the soup to leave the broth. This part kind of hurt my soul because I really love minced ginger so much, so I'm actually going to stick these remnants to the side and probably throw them in some other soup. I might just put them in a little bag in the freezer. So after it's all strained and we have our new pot of broth, I'm going to stir that up and also bring this to a boil, and we want to make sure it is at a boil when we serve our soup. So for our fixings, I have some spiralized zucchini. I just steamed a little bag of it in the microwave, some shredded Napa cabbage, 1 radish I cut into matchsticks, a little fresh cilantro, some cut lime wedges, some more green onion, and of course our Asian meatballs. So to assemble the soup, I'm just going to take my tongs and add no more than a half a cup of the zoodles to the bottom of a soup bowl. To that, I'm adding 4 of our pork meatballs. On top of that, I'm doing a handful of the shredded Napa cabbage, a little pinch of my radish sticks, a pinch of my green onions, a little pinch of fresh cilantro. And then you see my soup is still boiling. I'm just going to take a ladle and ladle over a couple spoonfuls of this broth on top of our soup fixings. I'll let that sit for about 2 minutes before taking a lime and squeezing it over the top of it, and then you can just drop the lime in if you want or discard it if not. And there you go. That is our pot sticker soup all plated up. I love this. It's so perfect, everything about it. Next up, we made Peace, Love, and Low Carb, another one of my favorite keto blogs. Low carb, slow cooker, kickin' chili, and when she says it's kickin', it definitely has some spice to it. So to start with, in a large pot, I'm taking 2.5 pounds of ground beef, using my meat chopper upper to break that apart some, start browning it. We are on medium heat, and she uses a whole red onion for her recipe. I'm just going to use 1 cup total, so I'm adding a half a cup of diced red onion right now, and we'll add some more later, and using my meat chopper upper to break that apart and just work that into our meat. To that, I'm adding 1 tablespoon of minced garlic, and again, we're going to continue to work that in. And once it's all nice and browned, we're going to remove it from the heat, drain all of that excess grease, and I'm adding it to the bottom of a large crock pot. Now we're adding our other half a cup of chopped red onion, 1 more teaspoon of minced garlic for good measure, and then I just diced up 3 celery stalks, maybe about a cup, 1/4 cup jalapeno slices. I just used jarred ones and I did not mince these. You could if you want. We're adding 1 6-ounce can of tomato paste, a 14.5-ounce can of Rotel with the juice in it, and that's just your diced tomatoes and chilies. And then she uses stewed tomatoes. I couldn't find any that didn't have sugar added, so I opted to use a 14.5-ounce can of just your crushed tomatoes. And I know you're like, oh my gosh, onions, tomatoes, this is high carb. This recipe makes at least 15 servings, so it all comes out in the wash. Adding 2 tablespoons of Worcestershire sauce, 4 tablespoons of ground like a chili con carne powder, 2 tablespoons of ground cumin, 2 teaspoons of sea salt, as well as a teaspoon of ground black pepper, a teaspoon of garlic powder, a teaspoon of onion powder, a teaspoon of dried oregano, half a teaspoon of ground cayenne pepper, and then I'm just gonna stir this concoction we have here. It looks like a mess from the bottom to make sure it's all nice and combined. And I'm just making a little hole here in it and placing 1 bay leaf. I'm just gonna tuck that in there so it can cook down and flavor our chili. Putting the lid on, I only cooked this on low for 6 hours, and I did stir it periodically as it was cooking. Here's what it looks like. You can see as it cooks, it gets more liquidy because all of our vegetables start releasing the liquid, especially celery, which is mostly fiber and water. Here it is plated up. I did serve it with a little bit of sour cream and shredded cheddar cheese on top, and it was kicking. So if you don't like spicy, you're gonna want to reduce or remove the cayenne pepper in this recipe, and maybe also reduce or remove your jalapenos. This was so tasty. Stores in the fridge well for doing like a keto meal prep on the weekend. Perfect keto ground beef recipe to cook up, feed the whole family. You can always freeze the leftovers of this as well. Excellent, excellent tasting recipe. Always looking for different ways to throw together a keto chili, and this is definitely a winner in my book. Next up, I made a quick broccoli and goat cheese soup. This turned out so well. It's from Ketogasm, and I followed her recipe pretty much to a T, and I will link it down below. So to start with, I took just a pack of the goat cheese from Costco over medium heat, added it to a stock pot with 3 cups chicken broth, a half a cup of heavy cream, and I just went ahead and whisked that all together until it was melted and simmering. Added 8 ounces of broccoli. Some people would probably want to add more broccoli to this, but I thought it was just the right amount. And then I brought it to a boil, simmered it for 15 minutes. While it was simmering, I added a whole teaspoon of sea salt and then a generous amount of pepper. Pepper's the only thing I really changed in the recipe. Then I carefully, but you see I still spilled it, so don't have a mishap like me, transferred the soup to a blender and blended it all together. Super quick, super easy. Here it is plated up. I did top it with a little bit of chives and some chopped up almonds. This was actually delicious. I'm not a fan of broccoli soup. My husband is a huge fan. That's why I made it. And it was like the quickest recipe of the week to make. Next up, we're trying this keto broccoli cheddar soup from Hey Keto Mama. Oh my gosh, I don't even like broccoli that much. I mean, I eat it because it's healthy and it's good for a keto diet, but this was so flipping good. So in a large pot, I added 2 tablespoons of butter over medium heat. After that was nice and melted, I'm adding between 1/8 and 1/4 of a cup of diced white onion and just stirring that around and cooking that for a couple minutes to give it a head start before adding a half a teaspoon of minced garlic. I'm just going to stir that around for 30-45 seconds more. To this, I'm adding 2 cups of chicken broth, and I'm adding 1 cup of chopped up broccoli, and I buy the organic bags of frozen broccoli from Costco. They're nice, big, healthy florets, and I just thawed one of those and chopped some of that up. Left some bigger chunks and then more fine chunks and added that. To that, I'm adding a half a teaspoon salt and a half a teaspoon ground black pepper, and just combining this all really well before tossing in 1 ounce of softened cream cheese. In her recipe, she uses a little less and melts it in the microwave first, but I found just adding it softened straight to the pot and breaking it apart with a whisk was fine and saved me a little bit of trouble. After that's nice and melted in there, I'm adding 1/4 of a cup heavy whipping cream and just mixing this all around really well, bringing it to a boil, and then cutting the heat off and adding in 1 cup of shredded extra sharp cheddar cheese and just mixing this in really well until it's nice and combined and melted. And then I'm sprinkling a half a teaspoon xanthan gum on top, and I always like to let mine sit for about a minute before I get in there and whisk it in. And I find that xanthan gum for me just mixes into the whole pot really well. I don't have to mix it into a separate little bit of liquid like you would with cornstarch or something. After that's all whisked in, we're all done and ready to go. Like super easy and simple. Here it is served up, topped it with a little bit of crumbled bacon that I just fried up in the air fryer and another pinch of that shredded sharp cheddar cheese. This was so good, and I don't think I've ever liked broccoli soup in my life, and I loved this. It actually tasted more like potato soup without the potatoes, and I'm here for that. The only bad thing about this recipe is it only made 4 servings, which was perfect for dinner, and when we reheated it leftover, it was just as good the next day. Next up, I did an adaptation of 2 Sleevers Keto Italian Sausage Kale Soup. I say it's an adaptation, but I really just totally changed the recipe altogether, but I'll still link it down below because it was my inspiration. So to Instapot on saute, I added 1 pound of Italian sausage, ground. Make sure you always check your carb count on any type of sausage because they will slip carbs in there on you. And I'm just going to
brown that and mash it, and I'm not worried about getting it all the way done, just worried about breaking it up. To that I added some salt and some pepper, which the recipe didn't add any seasonings, guys, so I don't really know how theirs would have tasted without any seasoning, but did add a lot of salt and pepper to it. A cup of diced onion, 3 heaping teaspoons of minced garlic, and then I'm just going to keep chopping that up with my meat chopper upper until it's well mixed. And then I'm adding a 12-ounce bag of frozen cauliflower florets and a 12-ounce bag of frozen kale. And on top of that, I'm adding 3 cups of chicken broth. The original recipe, they added plain water, and I really just don't even know how that would taste, because this recipe came out tasting really well the way I did it, but it could have still used some spice, you know? So then I'm just cooking it on high pressure for 3 minutes, and the recipe says to do a quick release after that, but I don't like doing that with soups because it tends to sputter and spurt and go everywhere, and I wasn't rushed on time. So you can see there, I let it naturally release for most of it and only had a tiny bit left to release by the time I came back to it. And then I'm just going to mix that all up. Now the cauliflower is so tender at this point that I'm just going to take the spoon and kind of break it up, because I don't like huge cauliflower florets in my soup, but I do want it to still have some chunky, kind of substance to it. So I'm just going to break those apart with the spoon a little. And then I'm slowly going to add a half a cup of heavy whipping cream to this. And I did leave my whipping cream sitting out on the counter while this was cooking so that it could get to room temperature, because I just think that mixes into the hot soup better. And I'm just constantly stirring while I do this and letting those fats really mix together well. If you didn't want your soup to be as fatty, you could brown your sausage on the side and drain any excess grease before you added it to your Instapot, but I didn't find it to be too greasy. I found it to be just right to really fill me up and leave me feeling satiated. And you're just going to mix it until you have the perfect creamy, awesome consistency. And then to plate it up, I did top it with a little bit of shredded Parmesan cheese. This was super delicious. Like I said, it had just the right amount of flavor to it. It could have used even more spicing up. I wanted to leave it a little bit more bland to be kid friendly, because we've had round 2 of upper respiratory illness in our house this week, and I wanted the kids to be able to eat this and get some of that kale in them. But next time I think I would just add some red pepper flakes to it as well. Again, original recipes linked down below, but use caution. I think if you cook it the way the original one is, it's going to be super duper bland. So at least add, your broth and your salt and pepper.
Next up, this is such an interesting recipe. It's a turmeric chicken soup. I really think it should have like lemon and cilantro in the name, because that is more so the flavor that you get from it. Just the perfect keto chicken soup to make, especially if you're sick. There's lemon flavors in it. So to start with, I'm using a Dutch oven, just an enamel coated cast iron one. You could just use a large pot if you wanted to. But over medium heat, I'm adding 1/4 cup of ghee. You could totally use oil or butter if you preferred. And for this recipe, it called for a whole small onion, but I'm just doing 1 cup of onion that I diced up. To that, I am adding 2 teaspoons of minced garlic. And then I'm adding some jalapeno. Now the recipe called for 1 whole jalapeno chopped up. I just used about 10 jarred little slices of jalapeno and put them in my little food processor and minced those. And I'm just adding that. I was not trying to mess around with getting my fingers all burned up messing with jalapenos. To this, I'm adding 2 tablespoons of grated ginger, and this is just some that I had in the freezer. And the recipe also called for 2 tablespoons of fresh turmeric, and I didn't have that, so I used a 1/2 teaspoon of ground turmeric instead, as well as about 1/4 to 1/3 of a cup of chopped cilantro. They called for a whole bunch, but we just went with this and it was excellent. Stirring that all around and cooking it down for about 5 minutes before adding 1 teaspoon of ground coriander and 1 teaspoon of paprika. Giving that a good stir, maybe cooking it another minute before adding in 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. And then I'm adding in some chicken broth, 8 cups, 64 ounces. I just did 2 of the 32-ounce cartons. And I did go ahead and use regular. I know most of the time, if you guys watch my videos, I cook with low sodium broth. For this recipe, I went ahead and used the full salted up broth, and on top of that I also added 1/4 teaspoon sea salt, as well as just a little bit of ground black pepper, and I'm gonna stir this all in. Now I'm adding 1 really large chicken breast. It calls for 1 pound of chicken. You could add more to that if you wanted. I just used just shy of 1 pound. And I'm taking 1 lemon that I sliced up here pretty thinly, and I went ahead and tried to pop all of the seeds out that I could, adding that to the pot as well. I'm going to bring up this whole mixture to a boil, stick a lid on it, turn the heat down, and let it cook about 25 minutes. Almost grabbed that handle with my hand. Be careful with cast iron. Now, removing the lid from that, we're just going to stir this around a little bit. Go ahead and fish our chicken breast out of the pot. Just going to put this in a separate dish. Use my hand mixer to shred that up super quick. If you don't shred your chicken that way, I highly recommend it. Adding all of our shredded chicken back into the pot and giving it a final good stir before we plate it up. Now, this was such an interesting recipe. I'll definitely be making it again, and I do want to try making it with the fresh ground turmeric next time I make it. I think this would be a perfect keto chicken soup recipe for when you're sick. I love like the combination of flavors in it. It's got a little spice, the cilantro, the turmeric, the onion, the lemon. It's the first couple of spoonfuls were tart, and I was like, oh no, this might not be for me. But the more you eat it, the better it tastes. I don't know. I can't describe it. If you don't like lemons, I definitely would not make this recipe, but if you do, try it out.
Next up, we have this awesome keto taco soup. This is adapted from a recipe from Maybelle's that I will link in the description box down below. So I decided to make it in the crock pot. To start with, I added 2 pounds of browned ground beef. You can see it's kind of hard to get out of this container. My husband actually cooked it for me the night before, just drained the excess grease and put it in a container in the fridge. To that, I'm adding an entire can of Rotel, and I did not drain the juice from it, and 1 small can of tomato paste. It's a 7-ounce can. I know this seems like a lot of carbs and tomatoes, but this is a huge batch of soup, so it all works out in the end. To that, I'm adding 1/2 cup diced bell pepper, and I just used some that I had in the freezer. And I'm adding about 3 ounces of frozen mild chilies that I had left over from a can. She calls for 2 4-ounce cans. I used what I had. It's still hard for me to get groceries delivered, and we're in an area that COVID is greatly on the increase, so we're opting to have groceries delivered. So we had to work with what we have, and I think it worked out fine. I just stirred that in a little bit, and then I'm adding the equivalent of 1 jalapeno that is diced up really finely. I just used jarred jalapeno slices and added as many as I thought would be 1 jalapeno and ran them through the little processor. And then to that, the recipe calls for 1 package of taco seasoning. I always make my own, and I didn't have any pre-made, so forgive me, I'm being a bad keto person right now because I did not measure this. I just always do it by hand, so measure yours definitely. But I just threw in some cumin, a little onion powder, a little garlic powder, some oregano, some paprika, some chili powder, dash of cayenne pepper, and about 1/4 teaspoon sea salt, and a good bit of ground black pepper. And there you go, that's my taco seasoning. To that, I'm gonna add 5 cups total of beef broth, and I always like to use low sodium broth because it's kind of scary when you look at how much sodium is actually in prepared broth. Then I'm stirring that all together really well. And again, I'm changing the cooking method a little. Obviously, I was in a rush with this recipe and I was not cooking it all day. So I am going to pop the lid on and cook it on high to start with for 3 hours. And once that part's done, I'm just going to give it a little bit of a stir. And then I'm going to add 4 ounces of room temperature cream cheese that I just diced up. And I'm also going to add 1/4 cup heavy cream. Stir this in really well. And then I'm going to turn it to low and cook it for an additional hour just to let all of that melt in and cook together. And once that's done, some of my cream cheese still wasn't broken apart, so I'm just taking my spoon and kind of mashing all of that onto the side of the crock pot to make sure it's all melted and incorporated. And here it is plated up. I topped mine with a little bit of sour cream, hot sauce, and sharp shredded cheddar cheese. I love this meal because it basically cooks a big double batch, so there's enough to eat for lunch all week and then to also freeze half of the recipe. So it's perfect for keto meal prep. We threw together this awesome soup, which is also a version of I Breathe I'm Hungry's recipe. I will link it down below. So it's a fake like keto beef barley soup. I did make it in the Instapot, but she does have stovetop instructions on her recipe. So to start with, I took about just 2 pounds of stew beef. I think she uses 3 in her recipe. I used 2. Little sea salt, little black pepper, avocado oil to the bottom of my Instant Pot on saute, a little bit more salt and pepper once I got it in there. And I'm just gonna do this in batches, and I'm just trying to get a nice sear on all sides of the steak, but I'm not worried about cooking it all the way through because I'm just gonna, turn it on high pressure in a second and cook it up. So I just kept repeating that process until I have all of my stew beef nice and brown. And now to the Instant Pot, still on saute, I'm adding 1 can of plain, no sugar added, diced tomatoes with their juice. And I'm kind of using that to scrape the bottom and make sure the pot's all the way deglazed. On top of that, I'm adding a 1/4 cup of frozen onion that I actually picked out of a mixed veggie bag, and I have a cup of frozen celery that I also picked out of that bag, a teaspoon of minced garlic, and then I'm just mixing that all up and adding all of my beef and its juices back to the pot. I'm going to top this with about 6 cups of beef broth. Make sure that it doesn't exceed your maximum fill line on your Instant Pot. And then I'm going to pop the lid on and cook this at high pressure for 30 minutes. Of course, I did the natural release and let it stay on warm for like 20 minutes because I get distracted doing something else every time. And giving it a good stir. You can see all of my meat's looking good. You could break up your meat further at this point. I chose not to. I'm adding 3/4 cup of sunflower seeds. This keeps it a cleaner version of keto, but you could definitely add walnuts or something else to it instead. And then I'm also adding 2 cups of raw cauliflower rice that's pretty much still frozen. On top of that, I'm adding a 1/2 teaspoon of dry thyme, 1/2 teaspoon of xanthan gum, mixing that together really well. And then this time I'm putting the lid back on and cooking it on low for 15 minutes. And I also kind of let it naturally release on warm for a while, stirring it up. And then I'm adding a little extra salt and a little extra pepper. And then I'm adding 1/4 cup of flat leaf Italian parsley. I just washed it, removed the stems, and I'm just kind of twisting it and plopping it in here, along with a teaspoon of red wine vinegar. And I'm just going to stir that together into the hot soup, and it's all done. And here it is, all plated up. I loved this recipe. It was very interesting to me. It's a very versatile recipe. You can leave some of the tomatoes out, change up your seasonings. You could use a different type of meats. You could really play around with it to make whatever kind of keto soup that you would like. And I just like the concept of using the sunflower seeds in place of barley, because that's something that I have kind of missed on keto, is that beef barley kind of soup.
Next up, we have this low carb goulash. Again, I'll link the original recipe down below. I did decrease some of the onion and stuff in this recipe to lower the carbs a little bit more. So to start with, I took a pound of ground beef and just over medium-high heat, I am breaking that apart with my meat chopper upper. I always have linked in the description box. Once it's halfway browned, I'm adding a 1/2 cup of chopped up onion and 1 teaspoon of minced garlic. Working that in with the meat chopper upper, and then I have some Rayo's marinara sauce here. I'd already used a 1/2 cup out of it, so it's 24 ounces I'm adding to the pot and stirring that in really well. To that, I'm also adding 1 cup of beef broth, as well as 3 medium zucchini that I just chopped up into half-moon chunks. And I did leave these thick enough so that after they cook in the sauce, they still have a little bit of a firm texture to them, as I don't really like mushy zucchini. To that, I'm adding 1 tablespoon of soy sauce, as well as 1 tablespoon of Italian seasoning. And they called for seasoning salt, but the second ingredient in that is sugar. So I'm using this Creole seasoning instead, which has salt included in it, and just adding 1 teaspoon of that. Now mixing from the bottom, I'm stirring this all in until it's nice and combined. Adding 1 bay leaf, and I'm just gonna push that down into our sauce so it can flavor the whole pot while it's cooking. Bringing it up to a boil, giving it 1 final stir before popping a lid on this and turning the heat down and letting it simmer for about 20 minutes. And after it does, we're just gonna fish that little bay leaf out. Go ahead and remove it. Although I do like to leave those in there when I store it, just to keep giving it more flavor. We'll remove it. And here it is plated up. I did just top this with a little shredded Italian blend cheeses. This was excellent. Just straight keto comfort food. Super easy. I mean, chopping the vegetables is about the hardest part of making this recipe. Definitely recommend it. And even when I heated it up the next day, my zucchini still kept a firm enough texture left over. So So definitely try this one out.
Next up, we have this easy cheeseburger soup. Very delicious. So to start with, in a large Dutch oven that my aunt actually gave me. Thank you for that. I love it. I have some bacon that we're adding. Now this recipe called for 4 slices of chopped up bacon. I did 6 because again, I'm using thin cut, and I just diced that up, and we're gonna cook it over medium heat until it gets nice and crispy. Once it does, we're gonna scoop this out to a paper towel lined plate, and I'm gonna go ahead and scoop out as much of the bacon grease with that as I can. It's gonna all drain onto this plate, but we wanna remove as much of it as we can from our Dutch oven. You don't have to use that. You could use a regular pot. And you can see the bottom of this enamel has got this coating on it, but no worries. It's all gonna come, it's gonna deglaze when we start making the soup. So to that, I'm also adding a couple tablespoons of unsalted butter. Once that gets nice and melted, I'm adding a pound of ground beef and using my meat chopper upper. I always have that linked in the description box. I love it. It makes my life so much easier. I am just breaking that apart. Once it's all browned, I'm adding 4 ounces of softened cream cheese, stirring that in, and to that adding 2 tablespoons of tomato paste, as well as a tablespoon of just regular yellow mustard, half a teaspoon of garlic powder, 1/4 a teaspoon smoked paprika, 1/4 a teaspoon sea salt, and 1/4 a teaspoon ground black pepper, and just mixing that together. And you can see I'm scraping the bottom of the pot as I do that, and then all of that stuff's coming right up. You don't want any burned bits in your soup later on. To that, I'm adding 2 cups of beef broth. I always use low sodium, and I'm also adding a 1/4 of a cup heavy whipping cream. And I'm gonna just mix this in and bring this up to a low simmer. And once that comes up to a simmer, I'm adding about 3/4 a cup of sharp shredded cheddar cheese, stirring that in, and then I'm just gonna let this simmer probably about 10 minutes until our cheese is all fully melted and everything is nice and smooth. Then I'm gonna add our bacon back in, and I'm just gonna stir this in and then actually turn the burner off and remove the soup from the burner so it can go ahead and cool down a little bit and thicken up some before we plate it up. And here it is, topped with some kosher pickle. My husband's a big pickle fan, and it complements the taste of the cheeseburger soup well. I don't like traditional dill pickles, so I didn't have any on mine. This was a great recipe, so super quick and easy. I highly recommend it, and it is also kid friendly, stores and reheats beautifully, and I'll definitely be making this one again. Next up, this is a recipe I've been wanting to try for a while. It is by Rule de Me. I'll link the original down below. This is called Not Your Caveman's Chili, and to make this, I have my kitchen scale out, and I am taking some beef that's already kind of cut up for stew, and I'm measuring out 2 pounds of it. Then I'm getting my food processor bowl, and I've just got a regular chopper blade in the bottom of it, and I'm taking out 1 pound and putting it over there. Sticking that to the side for now. I'm gonna take this pound and I'm just going to cube it up into really small pieces. And to just kind of show you an example of how small I'm cutting these, and I'm gonna do this whole pound of beef this way, sticking it to the side. In my food processor, I'm taking the other pound of beef, and I'm just going to pulse this repeatedly until this is all ground up and the consistency of just regular ground beef. Look at that. This would make an awesome cheesesteak. Just saying. And to go ahead and prep, I'm also pulling out my really big crock pot because we're going to finish the chili in that. So over on the stovetop, I'm taking a large skillet, and I'm just pouring in all of those cubed up stewed beef chunks, and we're just going to brown these over medium-high heat and just stirring those around until they're almost fully cooked. And we're going to remove them with a slotted spoon into the bottom of our crock pot, leaving the fat in the pan. Now we're going to add that ground beef to the pan as well, and I have ground it up so well I don't even need my meat chopper upper. I can just do it with this spoon, and we're going to brown it as well and remove it also to the crock pot with our spoon, leaving the excess fat in the skillet. Now to that, I'm adding 1 cup of onion. They use a whole onion. I just used 1 cup of chopped onion to make it easier to measure the carbs. To that, I'm also adding about a cup of diced green bell pepper, and I did just use a whole medium bell pepper for that, so it might be a little bit more than a cup. And we're just going to stir these around and let them cook on medium until our onions become a little bit more translucent and the veggies soak up all of that fat. Now while that's cooking, I'm going to make the sauce for our chili. So leaving that on the stovetop, I'm going and getting a medium-sized bowl, and to that I am adding 1 cup of beef broth. I use low sodium because that makes it just easier to measure your salt later on. 1/3 of a cup tomato paste, 2 tablespoons of soy sauce, and I use low sodium soy sauce as well, 2 tablespoons of olive oil, 2 tablespoons of chili powder, like the chili con carne powder, 1.5 teaspoons of cumin, 2 teaspoons of fish sauce. Make sure you use fish sauce that's 0 carbs or less than 1 carb per serving. 2 teaspoons of minced garlic, 2 teaspoons of paprika, a teaspoon of oregano, a whole teaspoon of ground cayenne pepper, 1 teaspoon of Worcestershire sauce, a teaspoon of ground black pepper, and a teaspoon of sea salt, and that's what makes it important to use low sodium broth. And then I'm just gonna get my whisk and mix this all together until everything is well incorporated and we have a nice sauce for our chili. Now moving over to our crock pot, you can see we've got the ground beef in there on top of these stew beef chunks, and now I'm just spooning all of those cooked peppers and onions right on top of that as well. And then to that, we're just gonna pour that sauce straight over it. And then we're just gonna go ahead and mix this all together really, really well. Now the original recipe says to simmer it for 2.5 hours on high in the slow cooker, and then to take the lid off and simmer it for like another half hour without the top. I just went ahead and put the lid on mine and cooked it on high for about 3 hours. And I did make sure to stir it periodically, because anytime I'm cooking with like a sauce like this in my crock pot, if you don't stir it up enough, it tends to get a little crusty on the edges, and I didn't want that. Here it is all plated up. I just topped it with a tiny bit of parsley just for a pop of color. The original recipe also says that if you want a more liquidy chili, that you can add some coffee to it. So if any of you make it and you do yours that way, let me know how that turns out, because I'm very curious about that. I served mine just like this to start with, and leftovers, we did a little sour cream and cheese on it, and oh my gosh, this was worth the trouble of grinding that meat up. So freaking delicious.
Next up, we made a version of jalapeno popper soup from ruled.me. Original recipe linked down below. I pretty much changed everything about this recipe except for the seasoning blend. So in a large pot, I took a tablespoon of bacon grease, and over medium to medium high heat, I've got that heating up, and I added 1/4 cup of minced up jalapenos. It's the equivalent of 3 jalapenos. I used jarred sliced, so it also has the seeds in there, which makes this extra spicy. And I'm just stirring those around for a little bit before adding in 2 teaspoons of minced garlic. And again, just stirring that around and cooking it for about 30 to 45 seconds more. To this, I am adding 4 cups of chicken broth. It's just 1 32-ounce container, and it is reduced sodium. On our seasoning blend, we're adding a teaspoon onion powder, 1 teaspoon dried cilantro, a teaspoon Cajun seasoning, then I'm adding a whole teaspoon sea salt and a 1/2 teaspoon of ground black pepper, and whisking that all together really well. Now to this, I'm adding 3 cups, and I mean, it's really packed in here, of shredded chicken. I took like a 2-pound bag of chicken tenders and just cooked them in my Instant Pot and shredded them. The recipe calls for deboning chicken thighs and baking them and cooking the bones down and all of that mess. That was too much work for me. I'm sure it tastes delicious the way they made it though, but too much work for me. So if you want dark meat in it, which will make it more flavorful, go ahead and add some of that. But for convenience sake, and because I prefer eating the white meat, I just made it with chicken tenders, shredded them with an electric mixer, put it in there. Now once I mix that all together, I'm bringing this up to a boil and then turning the heat down. I think I just turned it off at that point, adding in 6 ounces of softened cream cheese and a 1/2 cup of sharp shredded cheddar cheese, and just getting my whisk in there and breaking that apart and mixing this in really well until it is nice and melted and combined. And there you go. Plated it up with a little bit of crumbled bacon, some extra sharp shredded cheddar cheese, and a couple of jalapenos that missed the mincing process. This was extra spicy, very delicious, very thick because of all of the chicken I added. It's definitely more like a stew than a liquidy soup, and I loved it. It's very, very, very filling. This is inspired by No Bun Please. It's a Zuppa Toscana soup. I changed the recipe up a whole lot, so make sure you make notes of that if you decide to click on that and use it. To start with, I took a large pot over medium to medium high heat. I added 1 pound of mild Italian ground sausage. Make sure you check your carbs carefully on your sausage, as they tend to sneak a lot in there on you. And I'm breaking that apart with my meat chopper upper to start browning it, adding about 1/4 cup chopped onion to it, as well as 1 heaping teaspoon of minced garlic. And then I'm using my meat chopper upper to just break that apart and really work those onions and that garlic into our meat. To that, I'm adding 4 cups of chicken broth. And this is just a full sodium box of chicken broth here, along with 2 cups of water. Now the original recipe, they reversed those, but they did like 4 cups of water and 2 cups of broth, but I thought it would taste better this way. To that, I am adding 1 teaspoon of red pepper flakes,
along with 1 teaspoon of sea salt and half a teaspoon ground black pepper, and then I'm just stirring this all together really well before adding a 12-ounce bag of frozen chopped kale and 2 cups of frozen cauliflower rice. This is just convenience for me, along with 1/4 a cup of butter. Now I'm just popping that butter down in there and stirring this all together really well. I'm going to go ahead and bring this to a boil and pop the lid on and cut it down to medium low, and I let this simmer for about 45 minutes. After it was done, I added a tablespoon of cream as the recipe said and thought, hey, maybe I want some more in there. So I added 1 more tablespoon of heavy whipping cream to that. Stirred it in really well, have the heat off at this point, and we are ready to serve it up. And here's what it looks like in the bowl. This was so delicious. I feel like most Zuppa Toscana soups are more brothy and less kale, but I love incorporating kale into recipes. I feel like it always gives me a little bit of extra energy when I eat it, and so there you go. I wanted this to be very substantive for me, especially since I would be eating it all week long.
We made this low-carb Italian wedding soup. This was absolutely delicious. The recipe seemed a little intimidating, but it came together really quickly. So to start with, we put a pound of ground beef into a bowl and then added 1/2 a cup of crushed pork rinds, 1/2 a cup of grated Parmesan cheese, 3 teaspoons of Italian seasoning, 3/4 teaspoons of salt, 1/2 a teaspoon of pepper, and 1 large egg. And then I just got my hands in there and started combining that up and rolling it into little teeny tiny meatballs. When I first started making these, I'm used to making bigger meatballs, so I was making them like 1 inch wide. And then I quickly went back and corrected and tried to make them all about 1/2 inch. This is a recipe by the most brilliant and talented Carolyn Ketchum over at All Day I Dream About Food, and of course I will have it linked down below in the description box. And here is the whole tray finished. If you want to do these ahead, you could, but I just did them right before and left them sitting out. Took 2 tablespoons of avocado oil to a big pot, added 1/4 cup chopped onion, roughly 4 celery stalks chopped, teaspoon of salt, 1/2 a teaspoon of pepper, and just sauteed that down. And then after that, I added about 2 teaspoons of minced garlic to the mix and went ahead and let that simmer for about another minute, just until it was cooked down really well. Then I added a teaspoon of dried oregano to the mix, and again kept letting it simmer before adding 6 cups of chicken stock. You could use bone broth or whatever, I prefer the chicken stock. And then I just heated that and cooked it until everything was tender and boiled. And then I added 2 cups of cauliflower rice. I just used frozen one. And then I added my meatballs to the pot. And then just cut it down just below boiling. And it only took about 5 minutes for the meatballs to cook up. And they just kind of float to the top when they're done. And then you're supposed to add spinach leaves. But I had a little bit of superfood greens left in the fridge, which is mostly baby spinach, and then it's also got some other stuff packed in there, and I didn't want that to go to waste, so I just added what I had left of that. But the recipe called for 2 cups of packed spinach leaves. And then I just cooked that down until it wilted and came together a little, and here it is all plated up. You could top this with a little bit of Parmesan cheese if you wanted. I just left it plain. And this was a big hit. My husband was begging for soup. So we made this awesome white chicken chili. I really think it was more of like a combo in between a soup and a stew. So to start with, in a large crock pot, I have 2 pounds of chicken breast. I just used 3 really large chicken breasts here. Put a little sea salt and a little ground black pepper on them, as well as 1 teaspoon of cumin, 1 teaspoon of garlic powder, 2 teaspoons of chili powder, and just the chili con carne. And then we're going to do some mild diced green chilies. They recommend using 9 ounces in the original recipe. We're just going to use this 7-ounce can, and I did drain these really well. And I'm just sticking those right on top of the chicken. Then I'm adding 1/2 cup of low sodium chicken broth. And the recipe does recommend cooking this low and slow for 7 hours. We don't have time for that. We're going to do high for 4 hours and then make part 2. So after that's done, just taking the lid off. Now I'm throwing caution to the wind and using a hand mixer in the ceramic crock pot to go
go ahead and shred my chicken. I was super careful not to bump the sides or the bottom of the crock pot, but I would recommend you actually taking the chicken out if you're going to use the mixer to shred it, or just using a couple forks and shredding it inside of the crock pot. Now after I got that mixed, just pop the lid on, stuck that to the side, and over in a large pot over medium heat, I'm adding 3 tablespoons of butter that I just chopped up, as well as 4 ounces of room temperature cream cheese. To that, I'm adding a half a cup of sour cream, as well as a half a cup of heavy whipping cream, and I'm just going to get my whisk in here and stir and melt this until it's all combined and nice and creamy. And then I'm just pouring that directly over our shredded chicken, and I'm going to get in here and just mix this together really well. And then I'm just going to pop the lid on it and let it cook for 1 more hour on low. And here it is plated up with a little bit of fresh cilantro, a tiny bit of chopped red onion, and some shredded pepper jack cheese. And I did shred it myself to save on carbs. This was absolutely delicious. It stores and reheats really well. This would also be great to freeze the leftovers. Look how good this looks in the picture. This is a green soup. And I was very skeptical about this recipe. Of course, the original recipe is linked down below. But to start with, in a large pot over medium-high heat, I added avocado oil. You could use whichever type of fat or cooking oil you wanted. Once it was hot, I turned the heat down to medium and added about half a cup of diced onion. I'm just going to cook that for a few minutes until it starts to get soft. Did sprinkle it with a little bit of sea salt, adding a 12-ounce bag of thawed cauliflower, also adding some salt on top of it, which brings us to about 1/4 to 1/2 teaspoon of salt total. I'm just going to let it cook for a few minutes until it is softened, and then I'm going to add 2 cups of vegetable stock to our pot. Put a lid on, bring that to a boil. Once our cauliflower is all the way softened, taking the lid off and adding 1 5-ounce package of baby spinach, along with a cup of Italian flat leaf parsley, and I didn't chop it up because we're going to be blending this all together. 1/2 teaspoon of grated ginger that I just had in this little measuring cup, and 1 tablespoon of coconut cream, the coconut milk that we've been cooking with all week. That almost does it for that. And I'm just stirring this from the bottom until all of our greens are nice and wilted. Then I'm going to just take a ladle and transfer all of this to a blender and blend it on up. If you had an immersion blender, you could just stick that in your pot and do it. And then I do have the heat turned off at this point, and I'm just pouring it all back in. And here it is plated up. I just drizzled a tiny bit of the coconut cream I had left over on top. And because I had some green onions still from other recipes, I put a little of those on top. This was actually excellent. My husband and I both agreed that we just felt healthier as we were eating it. This is a recipe that I would not normally make, as pre-keto I ate even less vegetables than I do now on a ketogenic diet. Not something I would cook all the time, but definitely to change things up a little bit. It was a refreshing recipe to make and was actually pretty easy to come together, other than blending the soup, which if you've been watching for a while, you know I usually don't like doing.